In imperial courts, favor was never only a matter of intimacy. It was an administrative condition, a political resource, and often a precarious form of protection. A royal concubine could occupy a position that combined status and vulnerability in equal measure. Historical records indicate that such women were rarely judged only as individuals. They were treated as members of a regulated household, and their security depended on dynastic priorities, succession politics, court factions, and the ruler's changing attention. Once favor declined, the consequences could be severe, not because every court followed a single rule, but because many imperial systems tied female rank to obedience, fertility, and symbolic purity. When those conditions shifted, punishment often followed in forms that were legal, social, and physical at once. Surviving documents from imperial households reveal a hierarchy designed to make access to the ruler measurable and controllable. Concubines were often ranked, assigned quarters, and supervised by eunuchs, female attendants, or palace officials who reported on conduct and loyalty. In many courts, the loss of favor did not immediately mean violence. More often it meant a reduction in food allocations, removal from privileged rooms, loss of attendance, and exclusion from ceremonial life. This could be a punishment in itself. To be moved from an inner apartment to a more remote chamber, or from a titled rank to a lower category, was to become less visible and therefore less protected. Court life depended on proximity, and distance often meant decline. In the Chinese imperial tradition, legal codes and palace regulations show that the inner court was not separate from statecraft. Concubines could be promoted for bearing sons, and they could be demoted for political missteps, accusations of disobedience, or factional defeat. Contemporary accounts describe how palace women were subject to surveillance and how accusations of misconduct could be used to justify confinement or forced retirement. In some dynastic periods, especially during times of factional struggle, a fallen concubine might be ordered to live in seclusion, shaved into a convent life, or assigned to low-status service within the palace. The language of morality often disguised the exercise of power. Charges of arrogance, disorder, or improper speech were not merely personal criticisms. They were legal and political tools. The same pattern appeared in other imperial settings, though with local variation. In the Ottoman palace system, women in the imperial harem occupied a carefully structured environment governed by rank, access, and patronage. Favor could bring wealth, apartments, servants, and influence, but loss of favor could mean isolation, transfer, or disappearance from public memory. The harem was not a place of random indulgence. It was an institution with discipline and internal authority. Palace women were often supervised by senior figures who controlled movement and communication. When a woman fell from favor, the punishment might not always be spectacular. More often, it was administrative erasure. She could be reassigned, deprived of attendance, or cut off from any role in political mediation. In a court culture where visibility equaled power, invisibility was a form of sanction. Mughal court records and later chronicles also suggest that imperial women and concubines inhabited a world where rank depended on the ruler's household politics and the management of succession. Favor could elevate a woman's children, while a decline in favor could leave her vulnerable to the rise of rivals. The punishments inflicted on those who lost standing varied from restricted residence to total exclusion from court life. In some cases, women associated with a failed faction were removed from the center of power and placed under supervision elsewhere in the palace complex or at a distance from the emperor's daily sphere. Even when physical punishment is not documented, the social consequences could be harsh. Loss of patronage often meant loss of income, servants, and the ability to protect one's children. The most severe punishments were usually linked to accusations that touched on dynastic security. A concubine who was suspected of conspiracy, witchcraft, seduction politics, or involvement in succession disputes might face far more than demotion. Historical records indicate that in some courts, women accused of threatening the sovereign's household could be imprisoned, publicly degraded, or executed. Such outcomes were not routine, but they were always possible in systems where the ruler's domestic sphere was inseparable from state authority. The accusation itself often mattered more than proof. Legal codes of the period reveal that imperial courts preferred broad categories such as disrespect, impurity, disorder, or treasonous association, because these categories allowed the palace to discipline bodies without openly acknowledging political fear. This is one reason the punishment of fallen concubines cannot be understood only as a matter of personal morality. These women were often used to stabilize dynastic continuity, reward loyalty, and display imperial abundance. When they no longer served those ends, the court could recast them as liabilities. A concubine who had once embodied favor could be transformed into an example of discipline. Her fall reminded others that proximity to power was conditional. The court did not need to punish every woman in the same way. It only needed the system to remain legible. Everyone inside it understood that favor was reversible and that rank could vanish as quickly as it had been granted. Daily life under such conditions was defined by caution. Palace women lived within routines shaped by inspection, ritual, and competition. Food, clothing, and space were all graded by rank. Even modest changes in allocation signaled that a woman's position was weakening. Contemporary accounts describe the emotional atmosphere with restraint rather than drama, silence, waiting, and the gradual narrowing of one's world. For many concubines, the real punishment began before any formal order was issued. When visits stopped, servants were reassigned, and messages no longer came, the court had already decided. The body remained in the palace, but the social person had been diminished. Some women responded through religious retirement or strategic withdrawal. Buddhist and Taoist institutions, as well as secluded estates attached to imperial families, sometimes offered a path away from direct danger. Yet withdrawal was rarely an equal choice. It was frequently arranged by others after favor had been lost. In effect, the court converted potential scandal into controlled disappearance. A woman who had once influenced succession might be sent away under the language of devotion, illness, or repentance. The official record could present the outcome as honorable, even when it was the result of pressure. This dual language allowed imperial systems to preserve their legitimacy while disposing of inconvenient figures. What emerges from the historical record is not a single universal punishment, but a recurring structure. Favor granted access. Loss of favor reduced rank. Reduced rank made a woman easier to isolate. Isolation made accusation easier. Accusation justified harsher punishment. In some cases, the final outcome was retirement. In others, it was imprisonment, execution, or disappearance from the archive. The severity depended on dynasty, court culture, and the political stakes of the moment, but the mechanism was consistent. Concubines were valuable so long as they supported dynastic order. Once that order shifted, they could become expendable. The calm language of the archives can make this system seem less brutal than it was. Titles were removed, rooms were sealed, payments stopped, orders were issued. Yet behind these formal acts lay a reality of constrained lives, governed by fear of demotion and the permanent possibility of disgrace. Imperial courts relied on ceremony to appear stable, but their inner worlds were often marked by instability that was managed, not resolved. The punishment of a concubine who fell out of favor was therefore not an accidental abuse of power. It was one of the ways imperial power maintained itself. Historical records further suggest that the punishment of royal concubines cannot be separated from the broader logic of imperial succession. In many courts, a woman's safety depended not only on the ruler's affection, but also on the political usefulness of her children, relatives, and household alliances. A favored concubine who produced a potential heir could become deeply influential, but that same influence often created danger. When imperial authority shifted through death, deposition, or succession disputes, women once protected by the sovereign could rapidly lose standing. Courts that had celebrated them during one reign frequently reclassified them as risks during the next. In imperial China, particularly during periods of dynastic uncertainty, chroniclers noted that palace women associated with unsuccessful succession factions often faced punitive confinement. Under several dynasties, palace compounds functioned as highly regulated political environments where movement, correspondence, and access to information were restricted. Surviving documents suggest that women connected to rival princes might be placed under surveillance after the accession of a new emperor, particularly if they retained networks of servants or symbolic authority. Punishment did not always involve public trials. Quiet administrative decisions were often preferred. A woman could simply vanish from ceremonial life, her apartments reassigned, her attendants dismissed, and her name gradually omitted from official mention. The historical treatment of consorts following dynastic transitions illustrates how imperial punishment often relied on isolation rather than spectacle. Widowhood in royal settings could be politically hazardous. Some courts expected women attached to a deceased ruler to live under restrictions designed to prevent interference in future succession. In certain Chinese dynasties, surviving palace women were relocated to separate residences or temples. Historical records indicate that younger women who had held secondary status in the ruler's household sometimes experienced especially uncertain futures, neither fully honored nor fully free. Their existence occupied an uncomfortable category between ceremonial respect and practical exclusion. The Ottoman imperial system presents another example of how discipline operated through controlled separation. While the imperial harem could provide women with education, influence, and relative material security, it also functioned through rigid hierarchy. Contemporary accounts describe how women who lost imperial favor were sometimes transferred away from the political center of the palace. In some cases, arrangements were made through marriage to senior officials, effectively removing a former concubine from succession politics while preserving appearances. Such marriages could offer security, but they also served administrative purposes. The state redirected potentially disruptive individuals into new roles where they no longer possessed immediate access to the sovereign. When palace women became associated with factional struggle, consequences could intensify. Historical records surrounding the politics of succession in multiple empires suggest that accusations of poisoning, manipulation, or conspiracy frequently emerged during moments of instability. Whether these accusations reflected genuine wrongdoing or political convenience remains difficult to determine. Surviving evidence is often incomplete and shaped by chroniclers loyal to victors. Nonetheless, legal codes of the period reveal that palace women were frequently judged according to standards emphasizing obedience, modesty, and containment. Deviation from these expectations could easily be interpreted as evidence of dangerous ambition. This ambiguity made the position of concubines uniquely vulnerable. Unlike queens or formally recognized wives whose dynastic roles were more clearly defined, concubines often depended on unstable forms of legitimacy. Their authority rested heavily on proximity to the ruler and the favor attached to that proximity. Once removed from direct access, many lost the networks necessary to defend themselves against accusation. Contemporary observers frequently described palace environments as places of silence and caution, where servants carefully monitored changing alliances and where rumors could have administrative consequences. The punishment inflicted on women who lost favor was also deeply economic. Imperial households distributed wealth through systems of rank. Clothing allowances, food privileges, jewelry, servants, and residential comfort reflected official status. A reduction in rank therefore carried material consequences that extended into daily survival. Surviving palace regulations suggest that demotion could sharply reduce access to resources, effectively transforming someone who had once lived in extraordinary luxury into a dependent figure living under supervision. Such punishment communicated a broader lesson to the court. Rank was conditional, and imperial generosity could be withdrawn without warning. In some historical settings, confinement became a preferred mechanism of discipline. Palace imprisonment rarely resembled modern incarceration, yet it could be psychologically severe. Restricted chambers, heavily supervised residences, and limited communication placed women in prolonged isolation. Chroniclers occasionally described women spending years in effective political disappearance after accusations or dynastic shifts. Their existence became bureaucratically invisible. They were neither publicly condemned nor restored. Instead, they remained suspended within palace systems designed to prevent political re-entry. The use of religious retirement as punishment deserves careful attention. In several imperial traditions, convents, temples, or secluded residences offered a politically convenient solution for women who could not easily be executed but could no longer remain near power. Historical records indicate that the language surrounding such removals often emphasized spiritual devotion, repentance, or dignified withdrawal. Yet surviving evidence suggests these outcomes were frequently imposed rather than voluntary. Religious institutions became extensions of political management, places where inconvenient women could be monitored while preserving the appearance of moral order. The most severe punishments emerged when courts believed dynastic legitimacy itself had been threatened. During periods of crisis, palace women accused of participating in conspiracies sometimes faced execution methods intended to preserve ceremonial dignity while removing political risk. In some East Asian courts, high-ranking women might avoid public humiliation through controlled or private forms of execution. political purpose was clear. Open violence against elite women could undermine the image of imperial harmony, yet leaving rivals alive posed danger. As a result, punishment often balanced elimination with symbolic restraint. The archives occasionally preserve examples of women whose fall from favor reshaped entire political climates. Disgraced concubine could become a warning invoked for decades afterward, a story repeated as proof of the dangers of ambition, jealousy, or excessive influence. Historians, however, approach such narratives cautiously. Many accounts were written by male officials whose political values shaped interpretation. Women who exercised influence were often portrayed as destabilizing figures regardless of their actual conduct. Surviving documents suggest that accusations against palace women frequently reflected broader anxieties about court corruption and dynastic weakness, rather than straightforward moral judgment. This pattern appears repeatedly across imperial systems. Courts rarely admitted political insecurity directly. Instead, instability was personalized. Failures of governance became the fault of supposedly manipulative women. A ruler's poor decisions might be explained through narratives of seduction or palace intrigue, allowing institutions to preserve the image of male authority while redirecting blame. In this environment, punishment served not only to discipline individuals but to restore symbolic order. Removing a concubine from favor reassured officials that disorder had been identified and corrected. Yet the lived reality behind official records was likely more complicated. Daily existence inside imperial households demanded constant negotiation. Women formed alliances with attendants, cultivated relationships with influential officials, and sometimes supported charitable or religious activities to strengthen legitimacy. Even in decline, some retained influence through sons, adopted heirs, or surviving patronage networks. Punishment was never entirely predictable, because palace politics themselves remained unstable. A disgraced woman could disappear permanently, but on rare occasions, shifting alliances brought restoration. New emperors sometimes rehabilitated previously marginalized figures if political circumstances changed. What remained consistent was uncertainty. Historical records indicate that imperial courts rewarded loyalty while simultaneously creating environments where loyalty offered no guarantee of safety. The punishment of fallen concubines was embedded within systems designed to prioritize dynastic continuity over personal attachment. Affection, when it existed, rarely outweighed political necessity. Palace rewarded usefulness and punished perceived risk, often through methods so bureaucratic that their violence appeared administrative rather than personal. By reducing status, limiting movement, restricting resources, and erasing visibility, imperial systems transformed political exclusion into an everyday condition from which recovery was often impossible. In many imperial courts, the final stage of punishment was not always marked by dramatic endings, but by disappearance into obscurity. Surviving documents suggest that for numerous concubines who fell out of favor, the most enduring consequence was not execution or public humiliation, but historical silence. Palace records frequently preserve the names of women during periods of influence, especially when they bore children or participated in ceremonial life. Yet once political relevance ended, references often became fragmented or vanished altogether. Historians studying imperial households repeatedly encounter women whose lives seem to narrow into brief administrative notes, reassigned residence, reduced rank, transfer to religious seclusion, or simple omission from later court histories. This disappearance served an important political function. Imperial authority depended on projecting continuity and control. Rulers' households symbolized cosmic and political order, particularly in empires where monarchy carried sacred or semi-sacred significance. Disorder within the palace threatened that image. Contemporary accounts indicate that courts often preferred quiet removal to visible scandal. The elimination of a concubine from ceremonial life allowed institutions to restore stability without openly acknowledging conflict. Punishment, therefore, became administrative theater carried out behind walls, rarely seen by ordinary subjects. In some dynasties, elderly former concubines remained inside palace compounds long after their influence had disappeared. Their daily realities changed substantially. Reduced staff, fewer resources, and limited movement became ordinary conditions. Chroniclers occasionally described aging women living in relative isolation, sustained by fixed allowances, but detached from meaningful political life. Their proximity to former power contrasted sharply with their diminished status. They occupied spaces physically near the center of empire while remaining socially distant from it. The fate of children often shaped the severity of punishment. Historical records indicate that a concubine whose son retained political importance might receive limited protection even after losing favor. Mothers of princes could sometimes preserve rank or security because harming them risked destabilizing succession politics. By contrast, women without politically valuable offspring frequently faced greater vulnerability. Imperial systems rarely distributed mercy evenly. Survival often depended less on personal conduct and on political usefulness. The emotional dimensions of these experiences are more difficult to reconstruct. Documentary evidence from imperial courts tends to favor legal records, official memorials, and elite chronicles rather than personal testimony. Yet surviving poems, letters, and palace writings occasionally hint at conditions marked by uncertainty, waiting, and restricted autonomy. Rather than dramatic suffering, the evidence often suggests prolonged psychological pressure. To live within a hierarchy where favor determined safety meant that every silence, cancelled audience, or altered ritual could carry meaning. Punishment inflicted on royal concubines who fell out of favor was ultimately tied to a broader truth about imperial governance. Courts relied upon intimacy as a political instrument, while carefully controlling the dangers intimacy created. A woman could be elevated because she strengthened dynastic legitimacy, forged alliances, or produced heirs. She could just as quickly become expendable when those same priorities changed. Historical records indicate that punishment followed patterns of demotion, isolation, confinement, and erasure because these methods reinforced authority without always requiring overt violence. What remains visible across different empires is not a single universal experience, but a repeated structure of conditional power. Favor offered protection, but rarely permanence. Palace systems rewarded obedience, visibility, and usefulness, while preserving mechanisms for swift exclusion. The archives, restrained in language and often silent in detail, reveal an uncomfortable reality beneath imperial grandeur. For many royal concubines, the greatest danger began not with conflict, but with neglect. Once attention faded, the machinery of empire frequently moved on without them, leaving lives that had once existed near the center of power to dissolve quietly at its edges.